America 1945. After months of retreat and defeat, German POWs faced their greatest fear, American captivity. But what happened behind the camp gates left even the most hardened warriors crying. But before that, like and subscribe, and comment where you are watching us from. When enemies wept, German soldiers and American mercy, the Ardennes forest still smoldered when Private Heinrich Weber stumbled through the snow, his hands raised high above his head, uniform torn and bloodied from 3 days of desperate retreat. Behind him, the remnants of his company, boys mostly, some barely 18, emerged from foxholes and bunkers with the hollow-eyed stare of men who had watched their world collapse in real time. The Battle of the Bulge was over. Germany's last desperate gamble had failed, and now they faced the moment they had been taught to fear above all others, capture by the Americans. Friedrich had been 21 when he was conscripted into the Wehrmacht. Pulled from his family's bakery in a small Bavarian village where the war had seemed distant and abstract. 3 years later, he bore little resemblance to the eager young man who had believed the stories about Germanic superiority and inevitable victory. His face was gaunt from months of inadequate rations, his body scarred by shrapnel from Allied bombing runs, and his mind haunted by memories of friends who would never see home again. The American soldiers who accepted their surrender were younger than Friedrich had expected. Farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit who looked as tired and scared as his own men. There were no triumphant jeers, no brutal beatings. None of the savage revenge that German propaganda had promised would await any soldier unlucky enough to fall into enemy hands. Instead, there was a weariness that transcended nationality, a mutual recognition of suffering that needed no translation. Hands down. Slowly, the American sergeant said in broken German, his rifle lowered but ready. No sudden movements. Friedrich lowered his arms, surprised to find them shaking not from cold, but from relief. He was alive. They were all alive. That simple fact seemed miraculous after weeks of watching his comrades die in frozen foxholes, their bodies abandoned as the retreat became a rout. What happened next would haunt Friedrich for the rest of his life, not with horror, but with the bewilderment that challenged everything he thought he knew about war, about enemies, about what it meant to be human in the midst of humanity's darkest impulses. The American medic who examined his wounds was a soft-spoken man from Tennessee who introduced himself as Doc Wilson. He cleaned and bandaged Friedrich's infected arm with the same care he might have shown an American soldier, using precious medical supplies without hesitation or complaint. When Friedrich winced at the antiseptic sting, Doc Wilson apologized in careful accented German and offered him a cigarette from his own pack. "Why?" Friedrich asked in his limited English, gesturing at the bandage, the cigarette, the unexpected gentleness of his treatment. Doc Wilson paused in his work, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because you're hurt," he said finally, "and because this war's gonna end someday, but how we treat each other, that's what we gotta live with." The words were simple, but they struck Friedrich like a physical blow. He had been prepared for hatred, for revenge, for the kind of brutal treatment that had become commonplace on the Eastern Front. Instead, he found something he had no framework to understand: mercy from those he had been taught to see as subhuman enemies. As Doc Wilson worked, other American soldiers distributed blankets and hot coffee to the German prisoners. Friedrich watched in amazement as his captors shared their own rations with men who had been trying to kill them just hours earlier. Hans Müller, a 17-year-old from Berlin, who had been drafted just 3 months ago, began to cry as he held his first warm food in weeks. The sound of his sobs echoed across the snowy clearing, soon joined by others as the reality of their survival and the unexpected kindness of their captors overwhelmed. Defenses built from years of propaganda and fear. The journey to the prisoner of war camp took 3 days by truck, winding through the devastated landscape of eastern France toward facilities in the American rear. Friedrich and his fellow prisoners huddled together in the back of the vehicle, still half expecting the convoy to stop and the real brutality to begin. They had heard stories, whispered accounts of Soviet treatment of German prisoners that made death seem preferable to capture. They expected Americans to be different only in the sophistication of their cruelty, but the truck stops brought hot coffee and K-rations, food that was better than anything they had eaten in months. The guards were professional rather than hostile, treating their charges with the bored efficiency of men handling a routine administrative task rather than the vindictive pleasure of captors savoring their revenge. Johann Richter, a machinist from Hamburg who had been Friedrich's closest friend through the nightmare of the Ardennes, sat beside him in stunned silence, methodically eating his first real meal in weeks. "They feed us," he said finally, his voice filled with disbelief. "Our own officers haven't fed us this well since 1943. The observation hung in the cold air between them, heavy with implications neither man was ready to confront. If the enemy could provide better food than their own military, what did that say about the war they had been fighting? What did it say about the leaders who had sent them to die for the promise of ultimate victory? At one of the stops, Friedrich witnessed something that shattered another piece of his worldview. A young American soldier, barely old enough to shave, was sharing photographs from his wallet with a group of German prisoners. The pictures showed a family farm in Wisconsin, neat fields, healthy cattle, a white farmhouse with a front porch where an elderly couple stood smiling at the camera. The American soldier spoke no German, but his pride in showing his home was universal. One of the German prisoners, a farmer from East Prussia, nodded appreciatively and tried to describe his own family's land in broken English. For a moment, nationality disappeared. They were just young men far from home, missing families and familiar landscapes, united in the common human experience of longing for peace and safety. Friedrich watched the interaction with tears streaming down his face, realizing that everything he had been taught about American monsters and racial enemies was crumbling in the face of simple human connection. The processing center at Campi. Lucky Strike was Friedrich's first real glimpse of American organizational efficiency. Thousands of German prisoners moved through a system that was impersonal but not inhumane, bureaucratic but not brutal. They were counted, catalogued, photographed and interviewed with the same methodical care that characterized every aspect of American military operations. It was warfare as industrial process rather than personal vendetta, and the difference was profound. The American personnel conducting the interviews were polite, professional, and surprisingly well-informed about German military organization and culture. Many spoke functional German, a detail that impressed prisoners who had been told that Americans were too lazy and undisciplined to learn foreign languages. The questions were thorough but not abusive, focused on gathering intelligence rather than inflicting psychological damage. When Friedrich was asked about his unit's activities during the retreat, he answered honestly, expecting punishment or retaliation for the damage his company had inflicted on American forces. Instead, the interviewer simply took notes and moved on to the next question. There was no gloating about German defeats, no attempts to humiliate or degrade the prisoners. Just professional soldiers doing their jobs with competence and restraint. The medical examination that followed was perhaps the most shocking experience of Friedrich's young life. American doctors and medics treated wounds that had festered for weeks, provided dental care that had been unavailable even to German officers in the final months of the war, and administered vaccines against diseases that had decimated Wehrmacht units on the Eastern Front. They worked with professional competence and surprising gentleness, showing none of the contempt or sadistic pleasure that Friedrich had been conditioned to expect. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a young physician from New Mexico whose grandparents had immigrated from Mexico, examined Friedrich's infected arm with the same care she would show any patient. She spoke softly, in accented but fluent German, explaining each step of the treatment process and asking about his medical history with genuine concern. When she discovered evidence of chronic malnutrition, she made careful notes and prescribed additional rations without comment or judgment. "You're very thin," she said matter-of-factly. "How long since you've had regular meals?" Friedrich tried to calculate, but the timeline blurred together in a haze of retreating armies and dwindling supply lines. "Maybe 6 months, maybe longer." The rations, they kept getting smaller. Dr. Martinez nodded sympathetically. "We'll get you back to a healthy weight. It will take time, but your body can recover." She paused, studying his file. "You're young. With proper nutrition and care, you should be fine." The kindness in her voice, the professional concern for his well-being, the assumption that he had a future worth planning for, all of it was so contrary to his expectations that Friedrich found himself crying again. Dr. Martinez handed him tissues without comment, continuing her examination with the same gentle efficiency. Later, as he lay in a real bed with clean sheets for the first time in months, Friedrich tried to process what he had experienced. The American medical staff had treated him better than German military doctors had treated their own wounded. They had used expensive medicines and supplies on enemy prisoners, invested time and expertise in healing men who had recently been trying to kill American soldiers. It made no sense within any framework he understood. The barracks at the permanent POW camp were Spartan, but clean, heated and well ventilated in ways that German military facilities had not been since the early days of the war. Real beds with clean sheets, running water that was actually potable, and latrines that didn't spread disease through the ranks. For men who had spent months living in mud and filth, these basic amenities felt like luxury beyond imagination. The camp routine was structured but not oppressive. Morning roll call, work assignments, meals at regular intervals, evening activities that included educational programs and recreational opportunities. It was military discipline applied humanely, creating order without brutality, maintaining security without dehumanization. But it was the food that truly broke through their psychological defenses. 3 meals a day, every day, with portions that exceeded what most German civilians had seen since before the war began. Meat appeared regularly rather than as a rare delicacy. Bread was white and soft, rather than the sawdust mixture that had become standard in Germany. And there were vegetables, actual vegetables, that had not been preserved in salt or dried to leather consistency. The camp mess hall became a place of daily revelation for prisoners who had forgotten what it felt like to eat until satisfied, rather than until the food ran out. Friedrich found himself gaining weight for the first time in 2 years. His hollow cheeks filled out. His chronic fatigue began to ease, and his infected wounds healed with a speed that seemed miraculous. Around him, fellow prisoners underwent similar transformations, their bodies recovering from the systematic starvation that had characterized the final phase of Germany's war effort. Wilhelm Schneider, a veteran sergeant from Munich who had fought since 1939, sat at Friedrich's table one evening, staring at his plate of beef stew with an expression of profound confusion. "I've been a soldier for 6 years," he said quietly. "I've never eaten this well, not even in peacetime. How do they do it? How do they feed prisoners better than we fed our own troops?" The question haunted the barracks that night, as men who had believed in German superiority confronted evidence of American abundance that contradicted everything they had been taught. If America could afford to feed enemy prisoners at this level, what did that say about their industrial capacity, their agricultural productivity, their fundamental understanding of warfare and society? The psychological impact was even more profound than the physical recovery. Men who had been taught that Americans were soft, weak, and morally corrupt discovered opponents who could afford to feed their enemies better than Germany fed its own soldiers. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, forcing painful reevaluations of beliefs that had sustained them through years of increasingly desperate warfare. Johann, whose machine shop in Hamburg had been reduced to producing ersatz goods from scrap metal and hope, stared at the abundance of the camp canteen, where prisoners could purchase chocolate, cigarettes, and other goods that had vanished from German civilian life years earlier. With the wages they earned from work details, prisoners could buy luxuries that had been impossible to obtain in Germany even before the war. American chocolate, real coffee, cigarettes made from actual tobacco rather than dried leaves and sawdust. How? Johann asked Friedrich one evening as they walked the camp perimeter, watching American guards who looked bored rather than vigilant. How do they have so much when we have so little? We were told they were starving, that their economy was collapsing, that they were begging for peace. Friedrich had no answer because the question challenged the fundamental assumptions that had shaped his understanding of the war. If America possessed such overwhelming material superiority, why had German leaders convinced their people that victory was possible? If American soldiers could treat enemies with such unexpected decency, what did that say about the racial theories that had justified years of increasingly brutal warfare? The work assignments that began after their medical clearances provided another window into American society that contradicted everything they had been taught. German prisoners were employed in essential industries, farms that produced food for both military and civilian consumption, factories that manufactured goods for the war effort, construction projects that built infrastructure for post-war America. The wages they earned, while modest, exceeded what many German workers had received even in peacetime. Friedrich found himself assigned to a dairy farm in Wisconsin, working alongside American civilians who treated him with cautious but genuine courtesy. The farmer, a Norwegian immigrant named Erik Olsen, whose own son was fighting somewhere in the Pacific, showed Friedrich techniques for caring for dairy cattle that were far more sophisticated than anything he had seen in Bavaria. The efficiency of American agriculture was a revelation, mechanized, scientific and productive in ways that made German farming methods seem medieval by comparison. The Olsen farm operated with a level of technological sophistication that impressed Friedrich despite his determination to maintain emotional distance from his captors. Milking machines that could handle dozens of cows efficiently, refrigeration systems that kept milk fresh for days, tractors that could plow fields faster than teams of horses, and communication systems that connected the farm to markets, weather services, and agricultural extension programs across the state. But it was the humanity of his treatment that truly undid Friedrich's preconceptions. Mrs. Olsen, despite her worry for her son fighting against German allies in the Pacific, prepared meals for Friedrich at the family table and asked about his own family with genuine concern. When he mentioned his mother's letters describing starvation in their village, she quietly packed extra food for him to take back to the camp. "Mothers worry the same everywhere," she said simply, handing him a package of homemade bread and preserves. "Your mother would do the same for my boy if he were hungry in her kitchen." The kindness was overwhelming, incomprehensible within the framework of total war that had shaped Friedrich's understanding of the world. These people had every reason to hate him. He represented a nation that had brought death and destruction across the globe, that had allied itself with regimes of unprecedented evil, that had forced their sons to leave home and fight in distant lands. Yet they treated him not as a symbol of enemy ideology, but as a young man far from home, deserving of basic human decency. The evenings at the Olsen farm provided Friedrich with insights into American family life that challenged his preconceptions about democratic society. The family gathered around their radio to listen to news broadcasts, discussing the reports with a freedom of opinion that would have been dangerous in wartime Germany. They disagreed about political candidates, debated government policies, and criticized military strategies without fear of punishment or surveillance. Erik Olsen, who had served briefly in the First World War, spoke candidly about his doubts regarding certain aspects of the current conflict while maintaining overall support for the war effort. His wife questioned whether the bombing of German cities was morally justified, while their teenage daughter argued passionately for more aggressive action to end the fighting quickly. The diversity of opinions within a single household amazed Friedrich, who had been raised in a society where public disagreement with official policy could result in arrest. In America, Erich explained one evening after a particularly heated family discussion about post-war reconstruction plans, "We believe that arguing makes us stronger, not weaker. When people can say what they really think, we make better decisions. Maybe messier decisions, but better ones." The concept was revolutionary to Friedrich, who had been taught that strength came from unity, that dissent weakened the nation and played into enemy hands. Yet here was a society that seemed to derive energy from internal debate, that treated disagreement as a source of strength rather than a sign of weakness. The paradox was confusing but increasingly compelling as Friedrich observed how the American system functioned in practice. The letters from home that began arriving after several months of captivity painted an increasingly stark picture of Germany's condition. Friedrich's mother wrote of cities reduced to rubble, of families living in cellars and eating grass, of a population struggling to survive in the ruins of a regime that had promised them empire and delivered only devastation. His younger sister had died of pneumonia that winter, unable to fight off infection, weakened by malnutrition, and without access to medicines that had been redirected to military use. The contrast with his own improving health and circumstances created a guilt that was almost unbearable. How could he explain to his grieving mother that he was eating better as an American prisoner than he ever had as a German soldier? How could he describe the medical care, the clean facilities, the wages he earned working on American farms while his homeland collapsed into chaos and privation? The letters he sent home were carefully censored, but even the allowed portions seemed like cruel mockery of his family's suffering. Johann received similar letters from Hamburg, describing the systematic destruction of his city by Allied bombing and the desperate conditions faced by civilians who had once believed in ultimate victory. "My workshop is gone," he told Friedrich one evening, showing him a letter from his wife. "The entire district where I grew up, gone. She's living in a refugee camp, eating soup made from potato peels and sawdust." He paused, staring at the American chocolate bar he had been eating. "And here I am, growing fat on enemy kindness." The psychological stress of this contradiction drove some prisoners to mental breakdown. They could not reconcile their comfortable captivity with their knowledge of conditions at home, could not balance their gratitude toward American captors with their loyalty to the German cause. Klaus Hoffmann, a young officer from Dresden, attempted suicide rather than face letters describing the firebombing of his hometown while he lived in comfort in an American camp. He was saved by American medical intervention and provided with psychiatric care that gradually helped him process his survivor guilt and conflicted loyalties. But for others, like Friedrich, the contradiction forced a different kind of reckoning, a slow, painful examination of the beliefs and assumptions that had led to their current situation. If Germans were truly the superior race, why were they losing so decisively to supposedly inferior enemies? If American society was as decadent and weak as propaganda claimed, how had it managed to build the industrial capacity and military might that was systematically destroying the Reich? The educational programs that the camp administration established provided another perspective on these questions. American instructors offered classes in English, mathematics, and science, but also in subjects that had been forbidden or distorted in Nazi education: comparative government, economics, and philosophy. Friedrich enrolled in a civics class that examined American democratic institutions with a thoroughness that revealed the complexity and sophistication of systems he had been taught to dismiss as chaotic and inefficient. Professor James Mitchell, a former high school teacher from Minnesota who had volunteered for military service, encouraged questions and debate in ways that were utterly foreign to Friedrich's educational experience. In German schools, students learned approved facts and repeated sanctioned interpretations. Here they were asked to think critically, to examine evidence, to draw their own conclusions based on reason rather than authority. Democracy is messy, Professor Mitchell acknowledged during one memorable discussion about American politics. People disagree, they argue. Sometimes they make mistakes. But that messiness is also our strength. When leaders make bad decisions, we can change them. When policies don't work, we can try different approaches. Rigid systems may seem more efficient, but they're also more fragile. The observation struck Friedrich with particular force because he had witnessed the rigidity of German military hierarchy throughout his service. Orders were given and obeyed without question, even when those orders were obviously flawed or impossible to execute. Initiative was discouraged, criticism was punished, and the entire system depended on the infallibility of leaders who were, Friedrich now realized, as human and fallible as anyone else. The contrast extended beyond military organization to encompass entire societies. America, despite its apparent chaos and inefficiency, had managed to mobilize resources on a scale that dwarfed German capabilities. American factories produced more weapons, American farms grew more food, American schools trained more engineers and scientists than their German counterparts. The supposed weakness of democratic society had proven stronger than the supposed strength of authoritarian efficiency. The technical education programs offered at the camp impressed German prisoners with their thoroughness and practical application. Friedrich enrolled in a course on modern agricultural techniques that introduced him to scientific farming methods that were years ahead of anything practiced in Bavaria. The instruction covered soil chemistry, plant genetics, mechanized farming, and agricultural economics in ways that integrated theoretical knowledge with practical application. The American approach to education emphasized understanding principles rather than memorizing procedures, encouraging students to adapt knowledge to changing circumstances rather than simply following established routines. Friedrich found this method initially confusing, but ultimately more satisfying than the rigid instruction he had received in German schools. When he understood why certain farming techniques worked, he could modify them to suit specific conditions, rather than blindly following procedures that might not apply. But perhaps the most profound revelation came from Friedrich's interactions with other prisoners who represented the diversity of forces that had fought for Germany. He met soldiers from Austria who spoke of being absorbed into the Reich against their will, Czechs who had been conscripted from the Sudetenland, Poles who had been forced into German service after their homeland's conquest. The grand narrative of Germanic unity and shared purpose began to crumble as he listened to stories of coercion, resentment, and suppressed resistance within the very ranks of the Wehrmacht. Even among ethnic Germans, the unity that propaganda claimed existed was largely illusory. Friedrich met Prussian officers who looked down on Bavarian peasants, city intellectuals who despised rural traditions, and working-class soldiers who resented the privileges of their social superiors. The Reich had held together through force and fear, rather than genuine loyalty or shared values, and its collapse revealed the fragmented nature of what had appeared to be a unified national movement. The American system, by contrast, seemed to derive strength from its acknowledged diversity. Friedrich worked alongside prisoners and guards who traced their ancestry to dozens of different countries, who practiced different religions, who held varying political views within the broad framework of democratic values. Rather than weakening American society, this diversity appeared to enrich it, providing multiple perspectives and approaches to common challenges. The camp's library became a refuge for Friedrich and many other prisoners seeking to understand the world that had produced their captors' unexpected humanity. Books were available in German and English, covering subjects that had been banned or heavily censored in Nazi Germany. Friedrich read American history with fascination, discovering a national narrative built around ideals of individual freedom and democratic governance rather than racial superiority and territorial conquest. The biography of Abraham Lincoln particularly impressed Friedrich, with its account of a leader who had preserved national unity while acknowledging the moral complexity of his decisions. Lincoln's speeches about malice toward none and charity for all resonated with Friedrich's experience of American treatment, suggesting that the kindness he encountered was not accidental, but reflected deep cultural values that shaped American approaches to conflict and reconciliation. Friedrich also studied American literature, finding in authors like Walt Whitman and Mark Twain expressions of democratic idealism and skeptical humanism that contrasted sharply with the heroic mythology that had dominated German culture. These writers celebrated individual diversity and questioned authority while maintaining faith in human potential and social progress. Their work suggested that American strength came not from suppressing differences, but from embracing them within a framework of shared democratic values. The camp's medical facilities provided ongoing evidence of American commitment to treating prisoners with dignity and respect. Dr. Martinez continued to monitor Friedrich's recovery, providing treatment for chronic conditions that had gone unaddressed during his military service. When he developed a persistent cough that reminded him of the tuberculosis that had killed many soldiers in his unit, she prescribed antibiotics that were expensive and scarce, but administered without question or delay. The dental care program deserves special mention for its impact on prisoner morale and self-respect. Many German prisoners arrived with severe dental problems resulting from poor nutrition and lack of access to dental care during military service. American dentists not only treated immediate problems, but provided comprehensive dental rehabilitation that included preventive care, restorative procedures, and oral health education that would benefit prisoners for the rest of their lives. When Friedrich received his first professional dental cleaning in years, along with fillings for several cavities and treatment for gum disease, he found himself crying again, not from pain, but from the overwhelming realization that enemies were treating him better than his own military had ever done. The dental care was provided with attention to comfort and quality that exceeded anything he had previously experienced, including pain management techniques and follow-up care that ensured lasting results. As winter gave way to spring in 1945, news of Germany's final collapse reached the prison camps through official channels and contraband radios. Berlin had fallen, Hitler was dead, and the Reich that had promised to last 1,000 years had survived barely 12. For Friedrich and his fellow prisoners, the end came not as a surprise, but as confirmation of what they had already begun to understand, that they had fought for a cause that was not only evil, but ultimately doomed by its own contradictions and limitations. The reaction among the prisoners was complex and varied. Some felt relief that the killing had finally stopped, that families at home could begin the process of rebuilding their shattered lives. Others experienced profound grief for friends who had died in service of a lie, for cities and communities that had been destroyed in pursuit of impossible dreams. A few still clung to Nazi ideology, insisting that Germany had been betrayed rather than defeated, that the cause had been just even if the execution had been flawed. Friedrich found himself in tears once again as he processed the news of Germany's surrender. But these tears were different from those he had shed in medical tents and mess halls. These were tears of mourning for his sister who had died needlessly, for his friends who had perished in hopeless battles, for a nation that had sacrificed everything for the delusions of madmen. They were also tears of gratitude for his survival, for the unexpected kindness of his captors, for the possibility of building something better from the ruins of everything he had once believed. The end of the war brought new challenges and opportunities for German prisoners in American camps. Repatriation programs began to organize the return of prisoners to their homeland, but many found themselves reluctant to leave the security and abundance they had discovered in captivity. The choice between returning to a devastated Germany and attempting to build new lives in America was complicated by legal, emotional, and practical considerations that would shape their futures for decades to come. The transition from prisoner to immigrant required navigating complex legal and bureaucratic processes, but it also required a more fundamental transformation of identity and allegiance. Friedrich found himself studying American history and government with the intensity of a convert, learning about constitutional principles and democratic traditions that offered alternatives to the authoritarianism he had known all his life. The sponsorship program that connected German prisoners with American families provided crucial support for this transition. Friedrich was matched with the Olsen family, who had employed him on their dairy farm, people who were willing to take responsibility for his adjustment to civilian life, despite the fact that his nation had been their enemy just months earlier. The generosity was staggering, a demonstration of faith in human redemption that transcended the boundaries of nationality and recent conflict. Eric Olsen's decision to sponsor Friedrich's immigration was not made lightly or without controversy in his community. Many neighbors questioned the wisdom of bringing a former enemy soldier into their midst, arguing that other immigrants without military backgrounds deserved priority. But Olsen had observed Friedrich's character during months of work on his farm, had seen the genuine transformation that American treatment had produced, and believed that redemption was possible for those willing to embrace democratic values. He's not the same man who surrendered in the Ardennes, Olsen told skeptical neighbors at a town meeting called to discuss the sponsorship. None of them are. They've learned something about America that maybe we sometimes forget ourselves, that our strength comes from treating people decently, even our enemies. If we turn our backs on that now, what did we fight for? The process of becoming American involved more than legal procedures and language acquisition. It required learning new ways of thinking about authority, about individual responsibility, about the relationship between citizen and state. Friedrich had to unlearn habits of deference and conformity that had been ingrained since childhood, replacing them with the more complex and demanding requirements of democratic citizenship. The work was difficult and sometimes painful. There were moments of intense homesickness, of guilt about abandoning his homeland in its time of greatest need, of confusion about how to navigate a society that was simultaneously more free and more demanding than anything he had previously experienced. But there were also moments of profound satisfaction as he discovered capabilities and interests that had been suppressed under the rigid hierarchies of German society. Friedrich's naturalization ceremony, held in a federal courthouse in Milwaukee on a crisp autumn day in 1948, represented the culmination of a transformation that had begun with tears in an American medical tent. As he raised his right hand to swear allegiance to the Constitution of the United States, he thought about Doc Wilson, Dr. Martinez, Professor Mitchell, and the Olsen family. Americans who had shown him that former enemies could become citizens and that redemption was possible through the application of democratic values and human decency. The tears he shed that day were tears of completion, marking the end of a journey from enemy to citizen that had been made possible by a nation strong enough to maintain its humanity even toward those who had fought to destroy it. Friedrich had learned that true victory came not from defeating enemies, but from transforming them. Not from imposing one's will through force, but from demonstrating the superiority of one's values through example. In the years that followed, Friedrich built a successful life as an American citizen, establishing a farm equipment business that served the agricultural community that had welcomed him. His success was measured not just in economic terms, but in the relationships he built, the community service he provided, and the example he set for other immigrants seeking to make America their home. The story of German soldiers crying when they saw how Americans treated them became a testament to the transformative power of maintaining moral principles even in the darkest circumstances of war. It demonstrated that democratic values, when applied consistently and with genuine conviction, possess the capacity to heal even the deepest wounds and create bridges across the most bitter divisions. Friedrich's transformation from enemy to citizen, from conquered foe to grateful American, proved that the highest victory any nation could achieve was not the destruction of its enemies, but their conversion into friends through the simple application of human dignity and respect. The tears shed by German prisoners in American camps had watered the seeds of a different kind of victory, not the temporary triumph of force over force, but the lasting success of values that could transform hatred into understanding, enemies into allies, and war itself into an opportunity for demonstrating the best possibilities of human nature. It was a victory that would echo through generations, proving that the strongest societies were not those that could destroy their enemies most effectively, but those that could redeem them most completely through the persistent application of mercy, justice, and the unwavering belief that even the most bitter opponents could find common ground in their shared humanity.